So really it's a story of hardship, a lot of trauma, a lot of drama, a lot of unexpected events right from birth, a lot of shocks as a child, a lot of unknownness, not in a spiritual way, although it eventually sort of led to that, I guess. But a lot of unknownness on an earthly level as to my ancestry, my parental roots, my culture, my ground on an earthly level. It's like, where's home? Who am I? What am I? And so on. That kind of got ignited as a child even. As a child I was very introverted. As a child I was very shy. Not just as a child, but as an adult too. On a deeper level, as a child, I was very attuned to silence. So it was very easy for me to be isolated, or to be in solitude, to be alone. On the one hand, that was a great wound, because I had no friends and wasn't allowed the normal sort of Western upbringing of, you know, playing with mates after school and going to birthday parties and all the other stuff that kids seem to do. So I was kind of shut away from that. On the other hand, it was actually an easy place for me to go inside and sort of rest in emptiness. I got a big telling off once from my mother when I told her I was going to be a nun. I was only about 6 at the time. And I was very proud of myself, because that's where I felt at home in that, not that it was a religious thing, because I didn't have that particularly, but more like I really sensed that being a nun meant that you were alone with God. And I found that place very accessible. But I got a big telling off for that. For some reason it wasn't acceptable. So it was kind of, you know, both a blessing and a curse in some ways. A naturalness in being alone, but at the same time being very isolated from the world. So all of that created rather an awkward grown-up in my 20s. 20s and 30s, awkward, socially inadequate, a long period of, in my early 20s, of clinical depression. I was sent to psychiatrists and psychologists, but nobody could do anything. I was determined to stay in my little world, inner world. And a sudden, as everything was sudden in my life, a sudden breaking out of that in my late 20s, when 3 things happened concurrently, or pretty close to each other anyway. One was experimenting with LSD. The other one was long distance running. When I say long distance running, I mean long distance running, 20 miles, 15 miles and upwards. And the other one was meditation, although I only touched on it and then moved away from it, because I was horrified at the voices in my head, so I couldn't quite immerse myself in that. But LSD and long distance running did 2 things. One was, well, the first one was the running. The running gave me a sense of no self. At that stage, when you're running that length of that number of miles, something happens. And it was a transcendent experience. I wasn't able to put it into any framework, because I had no spiritual background, I had no religious background, and I had no particular psychological background, although I was a psychology student. I was studying for a PhD thesis in psychology, but it wasn't transpersonal psychology, it was experimental psychology, so we didn't, but in my beingness, in my soul, I recognized it as a transcendent experience of no self. That was my initial opening. That's as far as it went. I just continued running, and I continued not having that experience. It sort of faded, but it was a doorway, if you like. But a doorway that I didn't follow up with anything. The LSD was a little more persistent. It really parted the veils, and I also experienced a complete falling away of ego in those moments, not afterwards. And I experimented with LSD and the Tibetan Book of the Dead at the same time. So I had started my spiritual path, if you like, then. So I was able to recognize the clear light for the time that it was in effect. But that really opened a doorway of some sort where two things happened. One was that my whole world collapsed, my external world, my career, my PhD, my academic studies, my home, my partner at the time, my possessions, every single vestige on the material level apart from this physical body was stripped away very suddenly. And that created a loss of identity very quickly, and very dramatically, which was again a blessing and a curse. I lost a lot of things. I lost my whole path in life and my identity, but it was actually the beginning. That was really the beginning of an ego dissolution. And one thing I saw very clearly was that my motivation, there were lots of motivations, but the core motivation of studying for a PhD was driven by the need to feel worthy. Yeah. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. We all do things in order to be recognized, and that's a driving force in the human experience. But for some reason, seeing that so clearly and in the stark light of a powerful LSD experience just smashed it for me. I couldn't do it anymore. And the world reflected that. Certain conditions at the university I was studying were repelling me from continuing with that. And I had been there at that university for 13 years. So it's not at the beginning, it was at the end. I was about to get a PhD in 6 months from that point, but 6 months before that point, this whole thing happened. And it was a huge thing for me. It's from that point that I started to unravel some of my conditioning. And that took all sorts of ways. Psychotherapeutic, psychospiritual, metaphysical, meditation, Zen meditation, Buddhist meditation. I really immersed myself in that. It led me to India. It led me to Osho. There were lots of openings along the way, but I wasn't looking for enlightenment. To me, enlightenment was what Osho had, what mystics. It didn't seem a human, in my mind. It was, so I wasn't looking for that. I was just looking for some, some relief or some peace or some happiness away from the torment of my own self. And even though there had been a big ego release, there were still lots and lots of layers. You can call that an awakening, but I don't see it that way now. I just see it as some things falling apart in order for a different process to start underneath that. So there was no, trying to look for enlightenment. There was just really looking for love. And that love was being searched for mostly through relationship in order to feel loved. My time in India was transformative on lots of different levels. But I came back from India with I guess something had evolved. I'd faced a lot of fears. I'd let go of a lot of defenses. And I had recognized, or I hadn't even recognized it. It's almost like I came back sort of located here. I was absolutely, very powerfully, almost like I was sitting here and I could see everything as scenery. And it's the first time in my life, and it stayed with me. It was like everything was scenery, all the good things, all the bad things. I went from the bliss of India, which was ecstatic and beautiful in all ways, inside and outside, and I went to a very difficult and violent relationship on my return. I'd left him, but I came back to him, and my living conditions were quite stark. In poverty and difficulty in the centre of London, and so the contrast was quite mind-blowing. And yet, for the first time in my life, I could just be here. Now, I was still drawn into the drama of it, but somehow consciousness was here, and that was also something that I developed through my many LSD experiences. Is that eventually, sort of, I knew that somehow I wasn't just this. None of it was very integrated. None of that was very embodied, if you like. It was just a sort of evolution without much direction, although it seemed to have its own direction. It's at that point that I stopped looking for anything. I stopped looking for a spiritual teacher, or I kind of just went into surrender to what is. Yeah, that's what I learned from being in India. Just surrendering to life, that life is the guru. And I just lived my life. A number of things happened. Somehow all of that, even though I didn't know it at the time, was preparation for the next stage, which was very unexpected, because I wasn't actually looking for anything then. I was living on my own. I'd split up with my partner. It was very dramatic. It was very painful. I lived on my own. I got used to living on my own, but something started to reveal itself that was unexpected, and that was the abyss. That abyss was experienced as a very barren landscape, like a dark night of the soul, where there is no God, there is no life, there is no meaning, there is no nothing. It's devoid. It really is devoid. And yet my external life was reasonably good. I was teaching a certain method of movement and meditation then. I had lots of different interactions. It was creative, it was flowing. So it wasn't to do with the circumstances, it was an inner experience. It's in that a deeper surrender happened. So in some ways everything had been a surrender, but this was a conscious surrender. Yeah? So the surrender had happened through loss and all these different circumstances that kept changing, but this was a different level of surrender, and it was met consciously. I consciously surrendered to the desolation of non-existence, and that's when something changed. That's when something changed. Like I say, it's I don't know how useful telling a story is, because it's different, so different for each person. It depends on your history, it depends on your background, it depends on your what direction you're going in. It depends what your questions are. There are many different factors. What was helpful to me, but that's just how I am, is that I didn't adhere to any particular teaching. Because I tried, but if I did, I found that my mind is so acquisitive, or it was then, that I would take it on board and then try to emulate it somehow in my inner experience. That's what we do. Yeah? Some of us more than others, but that's what we do in subtle and not so subtle ways. So it was actually better for me to not follow anything and to discover for myself. And the discovery was that life is the guru. Life is constantly calling you, like the beloved, into its arms, inviting you not just to have a blissful experience, but through the darkness, through the difficulties, through the challenges, through the darkest places. It doesn't have to be terrible on the external, but through the places that we hide from ourselves, within ourselves, to surrender to that, because everything is love. In the darkest places is light. And somehow that was the wisdom that I gained from my own direct experience. So that when that darkness revealed itself, which felt like death, it felt like suicide, and I know what that feels like because I've been to the brink of that many times, I recognized it not as another punishment from my tormented mind, what's wrong with me, but as an invitation to just give up into it. And that's what changed everything. It was unexpected. Yeah.
Wow, this is very moving.